Hey, I'm Rachel Billingsley.
I'm Luke Billingsley.
And this is GMT Talk, our insider podcast where we talk about all things GMT.
Today on GMT Talk, we will be interviewing Allen Dickerson, designer of By Swords Bayonets, the 9th game in the Great Battles of the American Civil War series.
Let's get into it.
Hi, Allen. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, glad to be here.
Yes, thanks for coming on.
Apparently, you and Rachel met at Consum World, but I've never met you before. So would you share with me and with all of us a little bit about who Allen Dickerson is?
Well, wow, that's a pretty big question, but
I guess we could say in the game sphere.
Right, in the game sphere. I guess the best way to describe is I'm a old grown-yard from way back when. I started gaming back in the late 1970s when I was in high school. And then all through high school, we were playing Terrible Swift Sword and Air War and Wooden Ships and Iron Men and Air Force Dauntless, all kinds of stuff. And then when I went to college, I just got involved in other interests and kind of drifted away from the hobby. And then after about 30 years away from the hobby, I came back to it. I always kept a couple of boxes of my old games in packing crates, during my many moves around the country. And, one day I just thought, you know what, let me get these out and see if I could get back into this. And I did. And, I found there had been lots of changes. I didn't even know about the death of SPI, which was my favorite publisher back in the day. I didn't know about that. And there was no Vassal then, and, all these things. So I, quickly learned about those things and, got back into it. And so, that's led me to this point.
Cool.
Okay. Great.
So I know today we're going to be talking about a little game called By Swords Bayonets. So I thought we'd start by maybe asking you your favorite Civil War battles, maybe 2 or 3, and why you like them.
Yeah, my favorite is Antietam because I've been there multiple times, and every time I go there, I'm just blown away by its natural beauty. If you've ever been there, especially near the anniversary of the battle, that's in September, and you go there and the fall colors are starting to come in and the corn is 7 foot tall, and it's just pastoral and it's beautiful. And of course, it's the backdrop for the bloodiest single day in American military history. So
Right.
it's kind of, you got those things kind of fighting against each other, but that is my favorite battlefield. Second, I would say Gettysburg. That's,
Right.
most people's favorite, just because of the places and the segments of the 3-day battle there are, just well known to just about everybody.
Mhm.
And it's one of those parks that if you go to it, you need to set aside 2 or 3 days, if you really, really want to get around it and get a sense of it because it's so huge. That's a second favorite of mine. And I guess my third favorite would be Manassas, also in Virginia. And, there it's kind of like 2 for 1.
Mhm.
You get 2 battles, first and second Bull Run or Manassas. And it's also, relatively unspoiled by progress and subdivisions and those sort of things. I guess I'll add a fourth and honorable mention, which only came on my list last year. A bunch of us people in the GBACW community met down in Dalton, Georgia, and it was a week of gaming, and then most mornings we would head out to Chickamauga and tour that battlefield in segments, and that has become one of my favorite places too. I went there maybe 4 or 5 different days and caught different parts of it. It was just a huge and also very beautiful place, very wooded, just broken up by these large fields and things like that. It was just so much to see and do there. So that's one of my favorites too.
Those all
That's
sound
great.
really cool. I know we went to Gettysburg, I wouldn't say like 10 years ago. And my dad actually showed us around because he knew a lot about the battle. So that was fascinating to go to all the different sections, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It's definitely one of those battlefields where you need at least a couple of days, just to take it all in. The first time I ever went to Gettysburg was back in, I think, 1985. And I remember I thought I could see it in a morning or something. And, I showed up there and I walked along Cemetery Hill. And I remember that, looking out over that huge mile-wide field that Pickett's charge came across. And, even then, not knowing nearly as much about the history of the Civil War that I do now, it made a really big impression upon me. And I walked along that, and I never did, really get to Little Round Top or anything like that. But that was all I had time for at the time, and I hadn't seen 25% of the battlefield.
Can you bridge the gap for us of you getting back into gaming and then getting involved with the Great Battles of the American Civil War series?
Yeah. Well, when I got back into it, I guess the first thing was I found out that the GMT version of the Great Battles of the American Civil War was like, not my grandpappy's Terrible Swift Sword, and everything had changed. I got a hold of a copy of Dead of Winter, and started going through the rules and everything like that. And I'm like, wow, this is really, really different. So I got into that, and then at the same time I discovered Vassal, which that really kept me back in the hobby, because
right,
it just opens up a international pool of opponents, or for you, whereas here in my town, this is probably a pretty good gaming town if you include, miniatures, role-playing games, family games, Euro games, all that. It's a pretty good town. But in terms of wargaming, it can be kind of hard, to find people with the same interests. So, having Vassal there, I was playing people in Canada and France and, every other state except for Oregon. So that, really kept me in the hobby. And so while learning Vassal, I took on the task of upgrading some of the modules for games that had been put out there. I thought I could improve them a little bit, and I started doing that. And at some point, Greg Lobach, the designer of Death Valley, reached out for me, and he asked me if I would be willing to create modules for Death Valley, which was in development. And so I foolishly said yes. And so he sent me all the stuff for what was then 4 battles. And so I created modules for all of those and thought, whoa, that was a lot of work. Then I got another email that said, oh, now we're doing the 1864 battles. I'm like, what? How many will there end up being? And the answer to that, of course, was, depending on the way you count Cross Keys and Port Republic, there are 10 battles in that box.
right.
And I created a module for 8 of them. And one has basically 3 different battles in one box. You can have Cross Keys, you can have Port Republic, or you can have Cross Keys and Port Republic together. So, it makes the math a little suspect. But I always say there are 10 in
Right.
that box. After that, then I became the Vassal guy for the system, and Dick Whitaker tapped me to work on Into the Woods, and I did that too. And then just about every project since then, I have been responsible for creating the playtest and the finished modules for those. And I've just recently gotten a little bit of help in the form of someone who is working with Dick Whitaker on the upgrade to 3 Days of Gettysburg. So
Okay.
there, I'm just one of the play testers. I don't have to worry about creating the module for that one. So, and that gave me a little bit of a spell. And Richard was instrumental in making sure that I didn't lose focus on By Swords and Bayonets, which I was also still working on at the time. And, he kind of protected me from everybody else, pulling me in different directions to do this and do that. And he was like, no, let him work on By Swords and Bayonets. So That was good.
I know Vassal is a ton of work, so that's really appreciated by the
Thank
whole
you.
team, I'm sure,
Yeah.
and by GMT, of course, as well.
Yeah.
All the fans and everything.
Yeah.
Right.
Um,
The work never ends. It's
That's right.
in addition to creating them, you have to maintain them. People find mistakes and things like that, point them out to you, and you have to upgrade them and re-upload them. And yeah, it never ends.
You mentioned in a previous interview online about By Swords and Bayonets that there's a funny story about how the game came to be. Do you think you could tell us a little bit about the funny story?
Yeah, actually, the story is kind of detailed in the designer's notes
Oh, okay.
in the game. But spoiler alert for anybody who wants to read them themselves, kind of move a couple minutes along. But
Mhm.
anyway, the project actually started nothing like what By Swords and Bayonets would turn out to be like. At the time, I was kind of mulling the idea of maybe I want to actually try my hand at designing one of these games. And so I had started also to learn some of the what I call the dark arts of production, and building drawing maps, building counters, production of what will be battle books and things like that. And I was learning all of that on my own, with Illustrator and Photoshop and all of that. And I had kind of set my idea on a project that I might work on. What I was finding was that I was having trouble developing the orders of battle, just because, certain battles and certain campaigns in the American Civil War you just can't get really, really good hard data on for various reasons. Sometimes, the actual records didn't survive. Other times there are other reasons why, you can't get a nice, clean order of battle the way you want it. And so I was finding that was the case in spades for the battles I was looking to work up. And then, one Sunday afternoon, I think it was in 2019, and I was just, on the internet as I usually am, and just looking around, and for some reason, the Battle of Rappahannock Station just kind of came across my radar, so to speak, and it just intrigued me. And so I, started doing a little bit of research, like on Wiki and other places, and I thought, this information is pretty good. And then, I got my copy of the original records, that huge encyclopedic set on CD-ROM, and I popped that into my computer and searched all that, and I found out, wow, this is really detailed. This is, the type of detail that I wish I could find for the other battles that I was working with. And so over the course of about an afternoon, I had, a spreadsheet set up for orders of battle for both sides. And, I'd gotten some topographic data, and I thought, wow, this would be a cool little battle to put together. So my idea was build this out, create a small game on on a small map, and shop it to C3I magazine, or maybe Against the Odds magazine, and get something out there to draw people in. And I thought, yeah, that's a great idea. So I reached out to Dick Whitaker, who's our leader. He said, well, I'll reach out to GMT and set up a meeting for you. And I thought, well, great. So anyway, I got an appointment with Tony Curtis. And so I, showed up. So I talked to him on the phone, and I told him my story, and I've got this idea, and I would like to be able to shop it to C3I, which I know, has some kind of a relationship with GMT, or maybe to Against the Odds, because this was kind of the type of battle that fit their format. And so Tony, he had a different idea. He said, well, we really like GBACW, and I don't know if we want games to be published outside of a GMT package.
Mhm.
So I thought, okay. But we had another idea. He told me about how, people are often intimidated by the rules and the the grandeur of GBACW games. And his idea was we should make something of a starter kit, he called it,
Hmm.
and also like a nod back to the past where SBI had a group of quad games where they would put 4 small battles in one box with the same theme, and they did really well with that. And he thought, maybe we could bring the quad game concept to GBACW. And I thought, oh, okay, all right, yeah, I see where you're going here. And I thought, well, that would be good. So okay, so I'll do Rappahannock Station and contribute to the project. So who's going to do the other 3 battles? And so Tony kind of left a little silence and waited for it to sink in. And then I realized, wow, I've been thrown under the bus. And so, within a very few minutes, I had agreed to do all 4 of them. And I'm like thinking, what are these other 4 battles going to be? I had put 0 thought into it. And so, away I went. And I thought, well, okay, this will give me plenty of opportunity to, work up my skill set with, map drawing and counters and order battle creation and all that, because I'll be working on 4 of these instead of just 1. So I thought, okay, this will be good. And that's basically how By Swords and Bayonet got started. And then I quickly worked up a list of other battles and got the lay of the land as to how much good or bad information I could find on those, and quickly worked up a list. And that's the story.
I love
That's a
it.
great story.
So Tony.
Yeah. You mentioned that By Swords and Bayonets is kind of almost like a starter pack, a more introductory level game for the series. So what do you consider to be like the meat, the best part of GBACW that you're trying to show new players who are introduced to the series in By Swords and Bayonets?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I'm gonna kind of twist it a little bit and spin it. My idea was to make By Swords and Bayonets a starter kit from the aspect of size and scale. Most people, who look at something like 3 Days of Gettysburg, and it's like, the 3 days of Gettysburg with all that that entails, and you've got the Union, you've got 7 Corps on that side, you've got the Confederates with 3 larger corps on their side, you got 3 days of battle, and it's just, by the time you're done with July 1st and most of the reinforcements have gotten through collecting at the town, you've just got all kinds of stuff going on. And, you've got turns where you've got 50 activation chits in the cup that you have to go through and go all across the map. And it's just like people are like, and then of course you've got your basic rule set for, movement and combat and command control and all that operating too, but magnified by 50. So people they just get overwhelmed by it all.
Yeah.
So the initial idea was to limit it to a 22 by 17 map sheet and no more than a division per side, and often a cut down division. And some of the battles even have just 1 brigade for one side and cut it down that way. Now, what I actually consider to be the heart of the system is the command rules. And if you really do a thorough analysis of it, you'll find that players are rewarded by keeping a unbroken command network from corps level all the way down to the brigade level, so that your army or your force operates at maximum efficiency, which is also a core concept. But if you take away the corps, there are no corps commanders in the entire box. Everything is a division, or in some cases just a brigadier or 2, then part of that goes away. So we had to mitigate, the lack of a corps commander, which is, in the overall system, the straw that stirs the drink. So, we had to create rules to mitigate that so that we don't penalize the player for not having their corps commander on the map, because he's not going to be on the map.
Right.
Yeah.
So also, knowing that this was an introductory kit, I was adamant about not making this a stripped down or an easy, version or simplified. I did not want to do that because my opinion on that is if you create a simplified version of the rules that players have to learn to get into the system, if you're successful and you get them really hooked, they're going to want to move up to the full boat system, and then now you've just ingrained a bunch of bad habits basically in the form of simplified rules or different ways of doing things. And now they
Yeah.
have to unlearn that, relearn the full boat system, and then you got a lot of confusion there. And you've also kind of made it worse. If the initial problem is just that people are intimidated by a 42-page rule book and huge games, now you've got them intimidated by the same rule set, which they've had to learn twice now. So it's like you're really
Yeah.
not doing yourself any favors. So I planted my flag in the sand really early, and I said, no, this has got to support as much of the system rules as possible. And again, knowing that there were not going to be any core commanders on the map, that was something we had to work through so that we could make the games work. And I was careful to put in the designer's notes and also in the battle book that if you're using this as a kind of a starter kit, make sure that when you're reading the rules you still understand the core to brigade command structure.
Yeah.
Because when you move up into the bigger games, that's going to be of even greater importance.
Very interesting.
Yeah, and it's funny that I say that the command structure is really the heart of the system, and it is, but it only really factors like at the beginning of each turn, where you work out your overall efficiency and you determine all of the forces on the map, how many chances they may have to activate, and then you put everything into a cup, and then you go through the turn. And then for most people, they would think that each activation, the activation segment, is the heart of the game, because that's where you move, you fight, you fire, you shock, you rout, you do all of these things. And it's like, well, obviously that's the resolution of the battle, and of course that might seem like it's the heart of it, but when you understand that keeping good efficiency or optimized efficiency such as it is, and keeping that command chain is going to increase or decrease the amount of activations you get, which in turn completely affects your ability to to manage your objectives in the battle. So that's why I say the command is really the heart of the system.
So the GBACW games depict tactical combat. What would you say you can learn from tactical games that you might not in operational or strategic level games?
I often tell people when I'm evangelizing for the system that the thing that really makes the GBACW system go and makes it worth ascending that steep learning curve and 42 pages of rules and a battle book with special rules in it and all of that, what makes that worthwhile is that when you're in the middle of a battle in our system, you get so much detail, and you're told you're actually writing a story as you play that you can tell your grandchildren in 10 years about what's going on. So you're pushing cardboard around a map, yeah, but at the same time it's not like, well, you're moving this counter here into the zone of control of another counter there, and you're hoping to push the enemy counter back one hex and advance, and okay, that's the operational or strategic view, right? So you might say, okay, well, the Second Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia is moving against the Union Fifth Corps, and they push them back one hex away from Richmond, and okay, yeah, that's fine. That may have happened. But in our battles, now you're talking about, the 15th Alabama with their buck and ball loaded muskets, or moving through across this ravine on this particular river and moving onto the flank of this other Union regiment, that hails from Michigan, and they wear black hats, and they're the cream of the Union Army, and they're waving their flags there and doing the rebel yell and all of that. So you get so much more detail. And also with the leaders, the brigadiers have action profiles that tell you whether they were fire-breathing firebrands during the war, or maybe they were cautious and they were looking for an excuse to call off an attack they'd been ordered to make, and all of those sort of things. Or even things like there was a Confederate brigadier at first battle at Manassas who had a aide around him who carried around what he called a barrelita of whiskey, to keep Shanks Evans, well oiled on the battlefield. And you learn about these things, and of course that contributes to that A for aggressive notation on his counter, right? So now where the aggression comes from. It's not because of his ardor at secession or anything like that. No, it's just because he's well into his cups at any given time. So all that flavor, if I can use that term, really comes out in all these battles. And if you combine that with reading a couple of good books on a battle that you may be playing or something like that, all of that flavor comes out, and you can really, really see what shaped the battle, what decisions were made, why something did or didn't happen, and then you can go back and you can kind of study it using the game. Or you can attempt to, change history. It's like, well, wait a minute. What if they had gone around, to this flank and tried an attack there? Sometimes you'll look at the games, and sometimes you'll get the answer just looking at the map. Oh, I didn't see this big wooded, swampy ravine over there. It's like, there's no way they could have made an attack around that flank because the terrain basically forbids it.
Right.
So you can learn those lessons just through playing the game and have a ton of fun doing so.
Very immersive.
Yes.
Kind of experience. That's cool. So we've gotten to know Bill Byrne a little bit through reading his articles on Inside GMT, some of the narrative type articles that are also very immersive. And he seems pretty passionate about American Civil War battles and this series. And we were just wondering what it was like to work with him as the game developer.
Yeah, Bill's great. Before he retired, he was a librarian by trade. And he's very, very scholarly and knowledgeable. And he's also our rules czar. And he heads up the kind of committee that undertakes the next version of the rules, and we're constantly trying to hone the rules and make them clearer, and people keep finding things that they're unclear about, and so rinse and repeat. And every couple of years we come out with a upgraded rule book that usually just clarifies some things. Occasionally there will be changes that really affect the gameplay. I think around 2019 or maybe 2022, there were some changes to the way artillery functions and upgrades to the line of sight rules, which are some of the ones that are the most nettlesome for even advanced players like myself. I'll play a game with Bill, and I'll think I have something figured out, and he'll go, no, actually it's this, and he can cite the rules case and tell me just how wrong I am. Oh, okay, wow. I've been doing that wrong for years. And so you constantly are learning whenever you deal with Bill, and he's also great to play, and playing with him is fun because you can banter back and forth. And I was play testing the upcoming Antietam game with him a while ago, and I had the Union and I had the the Iron Brigade, which is mostly made up of Wisconsin troops. And Bill is from Wisconsin, and his Confederates were like launching attacks and decimating the Iron Brigade. And I kept chiding him about the fact that, it's like, wow, it's like you're thrashing your statesmen. These are people that you live with. How can you do this to me? And he's like, well, we have to.
Yep.
So anyway, working with him, or playing with him, is really great. Working with him as a developer is wonderful, because one of the things that I really, really enjoyed working with these battles was my attempts at coming up with my own special rules, such as the rain rules in Mill Springs, among others, and also the rules around the Fort Thompson line at New Bern. And Bill helped immeasurably at making sure that what I was writing didn't run afoul of the rules, or finding a good way to work around them if they did. Also, I remember Bill spotted some issues with the pontoon bridge at Rappahannock Station, and we went around and round, trying to make it right, so that you could get a realistic result. And what would happen if you had units on that pontoon bridge if they were to take fire or attempt to shock across it, or be shocked while they were standing on it. And we were just going around and round and round and round, trying to make it work. And eventually we did. But it's great to have a resource like Bill there when you're really
Right.
into the weeds and working on something like that.
So I'm wondering, do you have any future plans to do any more smaller scale battles in this series?
Well, I'm not planning an expansion kit or a By Swords and Bayonets 2, if that's what you're asking. And I have been asked already. I hang out at Ard Wolf's counter clipping show on Monday. People were asking me, right after I had announced, okay, By Swords and Bayonets is, actually, been sent to the printer, and it's on its way back from China right now, and all this. And people were always asking me, when, and I was just trying to tell them whatever I knew. And then, yeah, somebody said, so, are you working on a second set of battles? I'm like, wow, so you haven't even seen the first,
Yeah.
wow. But no, I'm thinking this is a one-off, simply because it's supposed to be a starter kit. If it does its job well, and time will tell. If it does its job well, then people are going to be wanting to move on to the larger battles,
Right.
and the Death Valleys and Into the Woods and 3 Days of Gettysburg Deluxe, and all of that, and other battles that we've got in the pipeline already.
Right.
So
mission accomplished.
yes, it would be mission accomplished. For my part, I'm kind of circling the wagons and figuring out whether I really want to plunge into what might be my second project, which is kind of a Greg Lawback level, Death Valley and 10 Battles in a Box, and taking that same approach to the 1862 Peninsula Campaign.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, so I've been doing a lot of reading for that over the past couple of years, actually, in parallel with working up By Swords and Bayonets. And I'm getting close to a point where I'm going to be like, well, do I really want to do this? Because it would be a colossal project.
Right.
And there would be probably as many battles of varying sizes as Death Valley. There's also an element to the campaign that hasn't been seen in any of the other battles that I would really, really want to accentuate. And that was the really relatively poor leadership on both sides. So that not only George McClellan, but also Robert E. Lee, who was newly installed in place of Commander Johnston. He was newly installed as commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. So, he hadn't come up to his legendary status
Right.
yet. He was just getting started. So as a result, all of the major battles, and even the minor ones in the Peninsula Campaign, were marked by command lapses, commanders disobeying orders, not knowing what was going on. Stonewall Jackson was basically physically exhausted and falling asleep in his dinner, at key points in the campaign where the entire campaign could have changed if you had all the people operating at their peak efficiency
Yeah.
from later in the war. If all of that had been operating,
Mm-hmm.
the entire campaign could have been completely different.
Hmm.
And so that lends itself to having some of the larger battles set up to where, well, not only are you going to have a historical version of the battle, what actually happened, but you're going to have the ability to see what would have happened if the plan had gone the way it had been intended,
Right.
or if any number of things went differently. A lot of the events hinged on other events that happened or didn't happen earlier. What would happen if this event didn't happen? What would happen if Jackson weren't kind of at the end of his physical and mental tether? What would have happened if Longstreet didn't just completely disobey orders and go down the wrong road, and complicate all these things? So I'm thinking that even the larger battles are going to have 3 or 4 different ways of approaching and playing the battle. So the historical version of the battle might only be a battle of 3 or 4 hours because, in the real event, all of the odd stuff going on there limited a battle that was supposed to start at 7 a.m. and actually didn't get started until about 3:30 that afternoon
Wow.
because of all the confusion and people not being where they were supposed to be and all those sort of things. So I'm thinking there's like a lot of value that could be packed into those battles just by exploring all the different opportunities.
That would
Yeah.
be a super interesting game. Like, can you do better if all the circumstances go well than they did? And that's interesting.
Also, kind of one of my devious little plans is possibly to see if it is possible, and I actually think it is possible to create a project of that scale on the Peninsula campaign in '62 and not have or need a George McClellan counter.
Interesting.
Because if you look at the history of it, McClellan was notoriously not present where he could have been, or perhaps even should have been.
Hmm.
And for some of the battles, like Glendale and Malvern Hill, he was off on a ship on the James River doing recon for a spot to send the entire Army of the Potomac to hide after he had decided to change his base and run from the Confederates. So when he should have been trying to figure out a way that Lee wouldn't surround and crush his army.
Yeah.
So he's not there. He would show up at small intervals, and and the men loved him and they would rally around him and everything like that. But it's like he was showing up still miles from the battle and not really exerting the influence he should. So I'm thinking, I could probably make a point of that, not having a McClellan counter that everyone would be expecting.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, no, where
Hmm.
where was McClellan on this battle? He was like 3 miles away, at this particular house, and he wasn't sending reinforcements to Gaines's Mill. So Gaines's Mill, he was actually south of the swollen creek when he should have been maybe sending more forces from south of there over there to help Porter in the Fifth Corps.
I like these ideas.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of work though. So we'll
Yeah.
see.
So we'll let you go soon, but we just have a couple more questions we like to ask everyone we interview. So,
Sure.
do you have a favorite game by another GMT designer?
Yeah, I think I'm going to be a fan of Mark Simonich's 4X series. Everything's got a name of the battle 40 something.
Mm-hmm.
I've got all of them except for, I think, Ukraine 43. And I've got them all still in shrink sitting on my shelf, waiting for a time when I can really delve into them. And I'm really thinking that I'm going to really like Stalingrad 42
Mm-hmm.
because there was an old SPI game that basically shares the same footprint and the same scale. Drive on Stalingrad, that was it.
Okay.
And so I'm thinking that I might like Mark Simonich's take on it even better. And there's another game in our system pipeline by Albert Smith that's going to be called Stepping into Hell,
Mm.
and it's in
Yep.
P500 right now. And that one's going to be on the Battle of the Wilderness in 1864. And I've already told a number of people that I've been on the playtest team and playing several of the scenarios with Albert himself. And I was telling people I was more excited about Stepping into Hell than By Swords and Bayonets.
Wow.
And because it really has a couple of really interesting new concepts in it that I really think people are going to love. It is a really, really good illustration of how the terrain was so key in shaping that battle. So Albert's got these rules for drift,
Yeah.
where once you move off of the roads or trails, you move your units to where you want them to go, and then you determine, well, where do they actually go?
Right.
So, and then they can wander into ambushes, or all
Ooh.
sorts of weird things can happen. There are forest fires, which popped up on that field. Yeah, it's crazy organized confusion, and it's also a really good illustration of how the GBACW rule system tries to mitigate the fact that as players and historians often, we know the history, we know the commanders, we've got near perfect intelligence and all those sort of things, which you really can't do anything about. But the rule system still thwarts you from really taking advantage of all that sort of things, like the order change rule, where you have a great opportunity on the map to charge that open flank, but the question is, does your cardboard brigadier on the map see it? So you have to undergo orders changes, and so you roll for orders change and you get stand and retain. So not only do you not change your orders to an attack footing, but you won't move either for that activation. So all you could possibly do is fire at the enemy, which may not even be in range. So it's like, well, there goes your grand opportunity
Yeah.
begging, while you're sitting there watching it. You're like, go, go.
Please.
But no, they won't go. And there are numerous examples in the actual history where commanders were doing exactly that, standing up on a hillock somewhere with their telescope, and they're waving their hand like, go, go. I sent you an order an hour ago. Go, hit that flank. And they're all just dawdling over there with their thumbs in inappropriate places and doing nothing.
Right.
And yeah, so you get that in spades in Stepping into Hell. And you're trying to put in an attack, and you're moving several divisions to make contact with the enemy, and every time you move, the drift gets everything conflated and commingled and everything like that. So by the time you actually get to a position where, okay, this activation we're going to be able to push in there and do something, it's like, well, wait, no, I've got to fix all these disorganized regiments that were disorganized during the movement because of drift, and these guys are in the wrong place. My leader is not in a position where he can command all these. So now I got to spend time maybe fixing all of this before I can go in. And then the enemy comes in and hits you in the mouth, right, while you're doing this, and complicates matters. So it's complete chaos, but even the frustration is incredibly fun.
Good.
So
That
yeah, I'm
sounds
a big
fun.
fan of that game.
All right. So our last question is: who are a few people in the gaming hobby who have had a positive influence on your growth and development as a game designer?
First and foremost, I would cite Dick Whitaker, who bought the GBACW franchise from Richard Berg. And when he did that, when they were in negotiations, Richard Berg said, I'll tell you what you're going to do for me. You're going to reinterpret Bloody April, which was the SPI version of the Battle of Shiloh, and then would become for GMT Into the Woods. So that was part of the bargain. And in addition to whatever monies changed hands for him to buy the system, he had to commit to himself making Into the Woods, which he did. And he has just been, really, really instrumental in building a new core for the system. So we have, new designers such as myself, Albert Smith, and some others also who are working on other projects, nurturing us and helping us and encouraging us. And yeah, he's had a huge impact on me. The other person I would mention is Mark Ruggiero. Mark
Yes.
Ruggiero is, or was, I'm afraid to say, he didn't work on any projects for GMT, but he did work most notably on ILO 1807 for Sound of Drums. And he's actually even, the game was dedicated to him by Uwe Valentin. Mark was a grognard's grognard. He had this huge collection of games, and he was just rabid about all of it, and he just had a lust for life that was unparalleled. And then unfortunately he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer a couple of years ago, and then spent the rest of his life basically keeping up with his YouTube videos and things like that to keep the community fired up about gaming and showing his love for gaming, and at the same time battling this diagnosis. His example, of what you can do in the face of adversity, knowing you can't win,
Right.
knowing that you're going to lose. It was an incredible example for everyone he came across. I only met Mark in person twice. Once was at a convention here in Oregon 3 years ago now, and then last summer at a Consum World Expo. I only was physically in his presence a few short periods, but mostly, I knew him through videos and things like that, and we would converse on Facebook and other places and things like that. But his impact on everyone around him was just incredible. And so I'm sure some of that leached into By Swords and Bayonets indirectly, but he was a big influence as well.
He was a great person.
He was.
Yeah. Met him a few times at GMT weekends, and he always just had such a joyful attitude playing the games all weekend. Right. And he was really nice. That's all the time we have for GMT Talk today. Thank you so much, Allen, for taking the time to talk with us and chat a little, being our guest.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it was fun.
We will see everyone next time on GMT Talk.